Welcome to So-Called Discoveries, where we discuss stories, knowledge, and insights from somewhere to try to learn something. My name is Anthony Ozzie. In this episode, we are discussing Marcus Aurelius. He was a Roman emperor that ruled from 160 to 181 AD, and he is considered one of the great Roman emperors. He was also a proponent of Stoic philosophy. We're not going to dig into too much of the background and history of either Marcus Aurelius or Stoic philosophy into too much depth in this episode. So if you do want a little bit more of that history or background, check the show notes. We'll leave a couple of links for each of those. In this episode, what we are specifically discussing is a few excerpts from a piece of writing from Marcus Aurelius. And this writing was never intended to be released publicly. It was the personal writings of Marcus Aurelius, basically a journal, and his workings through philosophy, through logic, through reasoning, and him just trying to understand his life and work through his own problems and his own issues. He dealt with a lot, obviously, as a Roman emperor. He dealt with war, he dealt with famines, plague. He had to deal with the politics and the various duties related to the court of a Roman emperor. And he also had personal hardships. He had many children, and many of them died as children before reaching adulthood. He is somebody who it's interesting to look at his writings because you can relate to him on a human level. A lot of the times you're listening to him and you forget that you're reading something that was this all-powerful person, because he seems very human in his struggles and in his thoughts, and the fact that he, for example, just one thing that he talks about is struggling to get out of bed, and telling himself, like, look outside, look at all the animals, look at the plants, look at the nature. They all get up and they all do their work. Like, why are you sitting in bed? You need to get up and do your contribution to the world and to society and do what people do. So that's just a quick example. But he writes about so many different things, and the book is broken up into 12 parts. It's structured as book 1 through book 12. And like I said, it was never meant to be released publicly, but it was released publicly, and it was published under the name Meditations. That's the name of the book. So it's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And the copy that I'm reading is a translation that was written by George Crystal and published in 1902. And so the way I want to approach this episode is we're not going to be discussing the whole of Meditations. We're not even going to be discussing most of it or a great part of it. I'm just going to be picking out a few excerpts from the book that I like, that I want to discuss, and I'm going to read some of them and just give some reactions and some comments and some thoughts about what we're reading. So without further ado, let's get started. I have a physical copy of the book that I'm going to be reading from. Our first reading from Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The substance of the universe is docile and pliable. The mind which governs it has in itself no source of evil doing. It has no malice. It does no ill, and nothing is hurt by it. By its guidance, all things come to be and fulfill their being. So, just my first thoughts on this is that he's saying that the world is not against you. That you are insignificant. The world is indifferent to your existence. It doesn't really care. It has its overall governance and guidance by which all things are and exist and come to be. And you are just one small part of that. Another thing that he writes about is that he says, act the part which is worthy of you, regarding not whether you be stiff with cold or comfortably warm, whether you be drowsy or refreshed with sleep, whether you be in good report or bad. So he's saying, regardless of your conditions, regardless of how you feel, you're saying, oh, it's cold out today, or oh, I'm so tired, I need some rest, or Or if you feel the opposite of those things, maybe it's a nice, beautiful day, or you're feeling refreshed. He's saying there shouldn't be any difference in how you behave and how you act. There are things that need to be done, and the way that you feel in any given moment shouldn't dictate your actions. You should be able to act regardless of your feelings. And it's easier said than done, and he himself doesn't always fulfill that standard for himself. But obviously these are his personal writings. He's trying to psych himself up. He's trying to improve himself and think about things. And that's what he's striving for. He's saying, regardless of your feelings, regardless of the conditions, always act in a way that is worthy of you. He also writes, look within. Let not the proper quality or value of anything escape you. He's saying, look within. This is a Roman emperor. This is somebody who has enormous power, enormous influence. Many people are under his direct control and responsibility, and an entire empire is. And he's saying, look within. He said, don't let the proper quality or value of anything escape you. It reminds me of some things we've discussed in previous episodes. You don't need to have listened to previous episodes in order to listen to this one, but some of the things that we've talked about in our episodes on the book, The War of Art, and also from the Almanac of Naval Ravikant, is this idea of understanding yourself and discovering yourself and figuring out your inner uniqueness, or what the ancient Greeks called your inner genius, which is that essence that is unique to you, that calling for you. And Naval Ravikant talked about specific knowledge, and the idea of knowledge that you can't just be trained for. It's knowledge that you've developed based off of experience throughout your life, and things that you know and things that you've just done over time. So, yeah, look within. It's a good message, and it's one that resonates with me, and especially in the past few years, I've been thinking a lot about. It's that the answers and the solutions are not outside of you. Because I'm definitely somebody I tend to be a seeker. I try and go out and get things, or find things, or achieve things. And sometimes it's important to remind yourself that most of the answers and most of the solutions to the big things, to the big questions, you can benefit from looking within, and stop trying to find the answers outside of you, and instead find them from within. I don't know how else to say it. It sounds corny, but it is what it is. Another sentence that stood out to me from meditations is, the best revenge is not to copy him that wronged you. Basically, the best revenge is to not seek revenge after the person. It's to not stoop down to their level, or whatever it might be, whatever the context might be. It's just move on, let things go. Don't hold on to whatever impact or whatever harm has been done to you by somebody else. Don't let them win. Don't let them get that satisfaction. Another interesting thing that he says is, find your sole delight and recreation in proceeding from one unselfish action to another. I really like that. That's a sentence that, he's a Roman emperor. He's responsible for war and conquest and ruling an entire empire. But he says, find your sole delight and recreation in proceeding from one unselfish action to another. It's pretty interesting. And that's a good sentence on its own, but just the context of knowing who that comes from. He's a very interesting person to be in this position and to have thoughts like this. Anyways, just examining the thought on its own merits. When you find your own personal meaning and passion and satisfaction, when you find that in performing unselfish acts and in helping people, it's kind of interesting, because a lot of times doing things for other people and doing that with a pure intention of doing something unselfish to help other people, it does end up helping you. So being unselfish, it's kind of, I've thought about this before. It's like you can be selfish by trying to be unselfish, but knowing that certain unselfish acts are going to give you selfish benefit. I don't know. I mean, I'll call it out right now. Like I'm putting out material in this podcast for free. I'm talking about various books and various ideas, and I hope to also expose you to interesting guests in the future and interesting stories, and expand the things that we're going to talk about on this podcast. And I'm putting it all out here for free. And I'm doing it because, one part is obviously selfish, because one part is that I want to learn this stuff and I want to talk about this stuff better, and I want myself to improve. But the unselfish part about it is that I'm putting it out for everybody and anybody who might come across it and might gain value from it. But who knows, there might be some selfish benefit as a result of that. If it ends up being that my unselfish action ends up helping enough people and enough people resonate with it, then I might get some selfish benefit out of that. The next thing I want to read is, whenever your situation forces trouble upon you, return quickly to yourself and interrupt the rhythm of life no longer than you are compelled. When I read this, I think, whenever you get into some sort of trouble, whether that trouble is self-imposed, bad luck, whatever it is, whenever you run into some sort of trouble, don't waste any more time than necessary. Deal with the trouble, deal with the situation, deal with your hardship, and then return back to yourself. Return to your baseline as soon as you can. Don't dwell. Don't dwell in the trouble. Don't dwell in the hardship. It reminds me of a saying that says, when you find yourself in a hole, the first most important thing that you need to do is stop digging. Don't make things worse. Don't keep digging. If we extrapolate from that saying, we can think, when you find yourself in a hole and you've stopped digging, don't stay in that hole any longer than you need to. Get up and figure out a way to climb yourself out of there. Don't waste any more time than necessary. Don't keep messing up any more than you already have. Make better decisions and move forward. On another note, it also reminds me of a time in which I was playing chess with a friend of mine, and he was a slightly better chess player than me, but he won most of the games. I'd say 2/3 of the times that we played, he would beat me. And we would play several games in a row, often for 3-4 hours of playing chess, just one game after the next. And one day he said to me, after he had beaten me a few times in a row, "You know what I've noticed about you?" I said, "What?" And he said, "When you make a bad move in a chess game, if you make a mistake or an error, and I capitalize on that mistake, I've noticed that you tend to make more mistakes after that. Like, if you make one bad mistake and then I make you pay for it, it's like you're more likely to make another mistake on the next couple of moves after that." He's like, when you make a mistake and you lose a piece or something like that, you need to stop and think about what you're doing. And don't just immediately make another move without thinking about it, or just because you're just going to keep blundering. You're going to keep messing up. What you need to do is pause, think about what you need to do, think about how you can improve the situation, and make the best move from there. I'll never forget him saying that to me, because he was just talking about chess. That's all he was talking about. He noticed a pattern that I had in the game of chess, but I knew when he said that applied to my life generally. I knew immediately there was some deeper wisdom and meaning behind him saying that, whether he understood what he was saying to me or not. And when I read this, it reminds me of how that made me feel. It reminds me of where my mind went in that moment when he said that to me. And it's why I'm never going to forget that exchange. So I'm just going to read it one more time because I think it's impactful. He says, Whenever your situation forces trouble upon you, return quickly to yourself and interrupt the rhythm of life no longer than you are compelled. I really like that line. Now, this next part that I'm going to read from is him getting a little bit metaphorical. And he compares the idea of his court, which is his responsibility. Think of that as like his duties as an emperor, his responsibilities as the emperor of the Roman Empire, and his philosophy. So he, on one side, he has his court, and on the other side, he has his philosophy, which, philosophy being the way that he believes he should live his life, the best way for him to live his life as a person, as an individual. And then his court is his responsibilities to the empire. So the metaphor that he makes is he compares court and philosophy to stepmother and mother, saying that the court should be like his stepmother and that his philosophy should be like his mother. Now, I just wanted to give a little bit of a context preface before I read that from this part, just to prepare you for that. So now I'll read from it. Had you at one time both a stepmother and a mother, you would respect the former, yet you would be more constantly in your mother's company. Your court and philosophy are stepmother and mother to you. Return then frequently to your true mother and recreate yourself with her. Her consolation can make the court seem bearable to you, and you to it. So he's recognizing the importance of both his court and his philosophy. He recognizes that they're both important, but that when it comes to yourself and who you really are, and centering yourself and returning to yourself and expanding and building upon yourself, that needs to come from your philosophy. So when I read that, I think that needs to come from, what do you really want for the long term, for your life generally? What do you want your life to look like? Not just your day-to-day, your job, but what do you want in the long term? What do you want from your purpose and for your meaning? And like, how do you want to be as a person? How do you want to be seen and remembered as a person? What sort of an impact and what sort of a value, what sort of relationships do you want to have? So I think of that like the philosophy, and then the court, I think of that like just your day-to-day responsibilities, your work, whatever it is that you have to do, that you think that you have to do to get through the day, that you see as your responsibilities and your duties. So obviously both of those things are important, and I think that what he's really saying is that when you think of yourself as a person, it's like you need to prioritize that over, for example, your job. Your job it might feed into your overall meaning and your purpose, but it is not the meaning and the purpose. It is separate, and one is more important than the other. At least that's how I read this. And then he says her consolation, her being the true mother, which is the philosophy, her consolation can make the court seem bearable to you and you to it. So when you think about your purpose and your meaning and your values and what you want in the long term, it can make the court or your day-to-day, the things that you have to do each day, it can make that seem bearable to you. So if you ever struggle with some of your day-to-day things or finding meaning in them, it's you have to think about the long-term meaning and the purpose and the vision. And then once you think of that and you understand how that applies to your day-to-day, then it makes your day-to-day more bearable, and it makes you more likely to want to continue to pursue it aggressively and to motivate you to get going. Now, the next idea from Marcus that I want to talk about is the idea that everything in our world, everything comes from something or someone. He says basically whenever you have a meal, or whenever you think about the food on your table, he says, think about it in this way. This that is before me is the dead carcass of a fish a fowl, a hog. So he's saying this isn't just my food. This isn't just my meal. No, this is the dead body of an animal. This is the dead body of a fish that is sitting on my table. And he says, think of your purple robes as sheep's wool stained in the blood of a shellfish, because that's how they made the purple dye, was by crushing shellfish and creating a dye out of it. But obviously the material for his robes came from the wool of a sheep. So he's like, this isn't a robe. This is a sheep's wool stained in the blood of a shellfish. And he says, such conceptions which touch reality so near and set forth the sum and substance of these objects are powerful indeed to display to us their despicable value. In this spirit, we should act throughout life, and when things of great apparent worth present themselves, we should strip them naked, view their meanness, and cast aside the glowing description which makes them seem so glorious. One major idea from that reading that I get is, like I said, everything comes from somewhere. There's this, I have a glass of water right here, right? And this glass came from, like, I shouldn't take this glass for granted. This glass is made up of materials from the earth that were extracted. I can't make this glass. Somebody had to make this glass for me. There's a lot of knowledge that I don't have that went into me owning this glass, from developing it and building it to selling it and all of that. And I think having that attitude helps us to appreciate and be aware of the sources of things and just our dependence on the contributions of others in our society, whether it's other people or other animals or other parts of the earth. So that's one thing that I take from that part of the reading. And then another thing that I take from it is that he's saying strip things down to what they actually are. Like, just say what they are. So when he says the purple robes, it's important to understand, because you may not be aware that at this time, the color purple generally was a sign of just wealth and extravagance and really royalty. And so him having purple robes, that's a highly valuable object. That's a highly valuable possession that displays wealth and royalty. So he's saying, don't think of these as purple robes, like in the sense that, like, oh wow, look at them, they're so great, and there's some vain glory built into them just because it's such a beautiful object. He says, don't think of it as that. This is the wool of a sheep. Like, this was cut off of the body of a sheep and stained in the blood of crushed up shellfish. So he's saying it removes that glowing description that makes the object seem glorious. And it just helps you realize what it is. And it just helps bring things down to earth a little bit. And it's, it reminds us that we shouldn't be too caught up in the objects and in these objects themselves, and that, they are what they are. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean you shouldn't appreciate their beauty. But just understand what they are and don't be overwhelmed or overcome by whatever built-in glory you've assigned to it, because, like, for example, back then they associated the color purple with extravagance and wealth, and you look at that and you just think certain things because of that association. The next thing I want to discuss is some of Marcus's thoughts on time and change in the world generally, and just how the world is in a constant state of change, and that life and death is all change. So with that set up, I'll just start reading. Some things hasten into being. Some hasten to be no more. Even as a thing is born, some part of it is already dead. Flux and change are constantly renewing the world, just as the unbroken flow of time ever presents to us some new portion of eternity. In this vast river, on whose bosom there is no tarrying, what is there among the things that sweep by us that is worth the prizing. It is as if a man grew fond of one among a passing flight of sparrows, when already it had vanished from his sight. Our life itself is much like a vapor of the blood or a drawing in of the air. Our momentary actions of inhalation and exhalation are one in kind with that whole power of breathing, which yesterday or the day before we received at birth, and which we must restore again to the source from whence we drew it. So I think there's a lot of wisdom to unpack from there. And some of it is just very simple, obvious, but it's important to think about. And it's so simply put, but it's so true, which is that to be born is to have part if you already die. Because to be born is a death sentence. You don't know if you're going to survive another 2 minutes after birth or, another 100 years. But regardless, to be born is to die. I mentioned at the beginning that he dealt with a lot of death in his own life and hardship in his own life. One thing worth mentioning was that he dealt with the loss of many of his young children. So it's just important to keep that perspective in mind. But he says flux and change are constantly renewing the world and giving us some new portion of eternity. And, death is just a part of that. And that time is like a flowing river. And that he asks, what is there among the things that sweep by us that is worth the prizing? In this eternal flowing river of time, what is it that's actually worth thinking about? What's worth spending our efforts and time on? And he says, it's as if we grew fond of a single sparrow that was among a passing flight of sparrows. And then once we realize that we've become fond about that single sparrow, it's already passed and it's vanished from our sight. Another idea similar to what we talked about earlier with the purple robes and not putting too much value on objects. Expanding on that idea, Marcus says that we should always value our own intelligence over the objects that we possess. He says, will you then cease valuing the multitude of other things? If you do not, you will never attain to freedom, self-sufficiency, or tranquility. You cannot escape envying, suspecting, and striving against those who have the power to deprive you of your cherished objects, nor plotting against men who are in possession of that on which you set your heart. So he says, if you don't quit valuing this multitude of other things, these objects, these things outside of yourself, then you will never be able to escape all of the things that come with that, the envy, the suspect, the striving against people or working against people who have the power to deprive you of those objects. I think we can think of objects in many different types of ways. One way to think about it is we can think of our house as an object or a nice expensive car as an object. So if you value those things and you're always pursuing those things, then in a way you become trapped by them because you have to design your life and live your life in a way that you can continue to afford more and more of those things and building those things up. And you're also susceptible to other people. Either people who have the things that you want, that you might want to get after, or people who are who could potentially deprive you or take away things from you that you have. So you become beholden to trying to acquire more objects and trying to retain the objects that you have. And he says this is a problem and that what we should value our own intelligence. And he says this by saying that reverence and respect for your own intelligence will bring you to agreement with yourself, into concord with mankind, and into harmony with the gods. Then he says those are the things that will happen, and that's really all that you need. But he says if you value the objects, and then if you end up for whatever reason lacking those objects, you will be distracted by necessity. You'll be complaining. You will be uneasy. You will be unhappy because you don't have those objects that you value so much. But like he says, reverence and respect for your own intelligence will bring you to agreement with yourself. You can find satisfaction if what you value is contained within yourself. Marcus also writes, if a thing seems to you very difficult to accomplish, conclude not that it is beyond human power. So if something seems very difficult, if something seems very hard from your perspective, do not assume that it is impossible to do that thing. But if you see that anything is within man's power and part of his proper work, conclude that you may also attain to it. So then the second part of that is, if you see anyone do anything, then you have to assume that it is possible for you to also do that thing. So he's saying, if you can't do something, that doesn't mean it can't be done. And if anyone can do something, that means that you can also do it. It's an interesting perspective and a good mantra. You see sometimes, for example, in athletics, when somebody breaks a record, like for example, running a particular distance in a particular amount of time, it's like it's like that number's pretty stable, and then every once in a while some new person comes up and just shatters that record and goes faster than anybody has ever gone before. And then within the next few years, the average kind of lifts up and people start getting faster and they get closer to that number. Right? So it's like once you see that another person does something that before you thought was impossible, but you see another person doing it and you're like, oh, well, I guess it is possible for a human to do that. And then all of a sudden you see people getting faster. It's there's lots of examples like that in sports when somebody breaks past some threshold that most people didn't think was realistic before, and then all of a sudden the average rises. Another part from Meditations that I really like is the following. If anyone can convince or show me that I am wrong in thought or deed, I will gladly change. It is truth that I seek, and truth never yet hurt any man. What does hurt is persistence in error or in ignorance. I like this because he's saying you always have to be willing to change your mind, which is something that I buy into big time. It's you have to want your ideas to be tested. If you have bad ideas in your head and you're operating with bad information, you want to know that. And if you figure that out, that you have a bad idea in your head or you're operating with bad information, it's in your interest to fix that and to change it. So you have to be willing to change your mind, and you have to be willing to grow and adapt as a person. And he's saying that he seeks truth and that the truth never hurt anyone. And that what does hurt is persisting in error or in ignorance. So you want your ideas tested, you want to be willing to improve, and you always have to be willing to change your mind. The next part of Meditations that I want to discuss is about reactions. And Marcus talks about how we should not react with anger. We should stay still and calm and steady. And the way that he writes this is by saying that if someone was to ask him how his name was written, how his name was spelled, the normal reaction would be to just, carefully pronounce to him each one of the letters and just say, this is how my name is spelled. And then if that person, for whatever reason, responds by beginning an angry dispute about it, would you also grow angry and not rather mildly count over the several letters to him? So he's saying, if he asks you, how is your name spelled? And then you carefully explain to him, this is how my name is spelled. And then he gets angry and starts arguing with you and says, that's not how your name is spelled. So if that happens, he's giving a silly example here, but if that happens, he's saying, would you grow angry with the person and then engage in that argument? Or would you not just continue to be calm and mild because you know how the name is spelled, and saying, just again, counting over the letters and saying, nope, this is how it's spelled. So he says, thus in life, remember that each duty is made up of a number of elements. We should observe all these calmly and without anger at those who are angry with us. We should set about accomplishing the task which lies before us. He's saying just be focused, stay focused, stay accomplished, stay dedicated to accomplishing the task before you. And if somebody approaches you with anger, with dispute, you don't need to react or respond in like. You can just keep doing your thing, especially if you are comfortable and confident in your actions. Another line from Meditations that I really like is, it is shame and dishonor that in any man's life, the soul should faint from its duty while the body still holds out. In other words, do not let the soul die before the body dies. While the body still lives, you need to keep the soul healthy. And soul means probably a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For me, it has to do with meaning and purpose, and keeping certain things straight from a mental perspective. Certain mindfulness practices help me with that, such as journaling and meditation, and then physical exercise helps with the mental as well for me. But the soul or the spirit or whatever it is that keeps you going day to day, he's saying don't let that die while the body still holds out. So basically, don't just go through the motions in your life. I think that's another way of saying it, if I can interpret that a little bit, is, if you're in a place where you're just struggling to get through most of your days, most parts of your days, where you're not excited about your days, you're not excited about your life. Maybe you're struggling with understanding the point or the purpose or where you're headed, or how to make yourself better, or how to make yourself feel happy, or with some sort of meaning, or whatever it is. If you find yourself in a place like that, you need to make some sort of a massive change. You need to take some action in your life. Now, I'm not saying it's just you have a bad few days or even a bad few weeks, maybe, or especially if it's in response to something actually happening, maybe the loss of a loved one, or a breakup, or something happened in your professional life where there was a big change, or whatever. There's appropriate responses to things. But if you're just generally in a place where week after week, month after month, you don't have any joy in your life, you're just going through the motions and just doing what you have to do to get by each day, and maybe you're not feeling super like depressed or anything like that, but if you're just walking through each of your days and you just don't really care, and you just have to kind of say, okay, let's go, come on, one foot after the other, and you just don't really care too much about your life, it's really, in my opinion, that's not a good place to be in. It means you need to make some sort of a change. There's a better way to live your life. I promise you. There's a better way to live your life. And I don't know exactly how to find it, but I know that if it's not good to be in a place where you're just continuously indifferent about your life. You need to have some spirit, you need to have some soul, and you need to let that guide you and not just go through the motions. Moving on, this next part seems to be dealing with a bad dream, but I think it can also be applied to just dealing with just bad thoughts or troubled thoughts or negative thoughts or dark thoughts as well. Just anything that we feel anxious about or anything that's troubling us on our minds. But it's talked about from the perspective of a bad dream. And Marcus writes, sober yourself, recall your senses, shake sleep from you, and know that it was a dream that troubled you. And now you are broad awake again. Regard the waking world as you did the dream. So what he's saying is the dream felt real. The negative thoughts felt real. But the waking world is real. You took the dream seriously because the dream felt extremely real. Well, now you're in the waking world and it is real. And he's reminding himself, take this waking world as seriously as you took the dream. Do not be dormant in your real life, basically. Do not let all the activity happen in your head. You need to take seriously the real world. So I think that applies, he writes about dreams, but I think that applies a lot to just people where they build. I know I deal with this personally, where I think about things a lot and I overanalyze and I overthink. And sometimes I can get some anxious thoughts in my head that can sometimes be a little bit self-destructive or negative or whatever it is. And then that becomes my perception, and then that becomes my reality. It's important to get outside of your head sometimes and, talk things out with people, and just to remember that what was in your head was simply that. It was in your head. That doesn't mean it's wrong. That doesn't mean it's invalid, but it's not in the real world. It's in your head. So speaking of negativity, speaking of darkness, Marcus, in some of his writing, explains that he doesn't see certain acts as dark or evil in the world. Like, for example, the jaws of a lion or poison or thorns. He says these things are all the consequences of the grand and the beautiful. And he says, do not imagine that they are foreign to that which you revere, but consider well the source of all things. Basically, he says that all things in the entire universe is connected. He says all things are small, changeable, and fleeting. Everything proceeds from the universal intelligence, either directly or as a consequence. So any evil that you see in the world, he says it stems from the same source of anything that you revere, anything that's beautiful, anything that you consider good. It all comes from the same place. It's an interesting thought. He also says, adapt yourself to the things which your destiny has given you. Wow. Adapt yourselves to the things which your destiny has given you. Okay. And I think another part, which we've touched upon this in previous episodes, a big part of our lives' goal is or should be to discover your own destiny. In other words, to discover who you truly are and then live up to that person. So obviously, once we put in perhaps a lifetime's work of doing that, or as we're doing a lifetime's work of doing that, Marcus also says, adapt yourself to the things which your destiny has given you. So discover what your destiny has given you and then adapt yourself to that. If you realize that there are certain gifts, certain talents that you have that come easier to you than to others, and that maybe to you it feels a little bit like play and that you enjoy doing it, adapt yourself to that. That's a gift from your destiny. And it's something that you can build on. I really like this because it's asking people to think about their own lives and think about what they have and what gifts that they have. And it's all thinking about what's within your own power, what's within your own individual control to make yourself better, and then therefore make the world better by making yourself better. Along the lines of thinking about, what's within your power, what's within your control, Marcus writes that we should only judge things that are in our power to be good or evil. So he's saying don't judge anything as good or evil or good or bad or positive as negative that is outside of your power or outside of your control, because there's nothing you can do about it. There's no point in saying this is good or this is bad. There's nothing you can do about it. It just is. It's outside of your control. It's outside of your power. And there's no point in judging it. It just is. So he says, if you do that, then there is no reason left for accusing the gods or for hating men. So basically saying, if you do that, if you only judge things that are within your own power, within your own control, within yourself, then there's no reason left for blaming anyone for anything. You can't blame the world. You can't blame the universe. You can't be jealous of anybody or spiteful of anyone. If you only judge the things within your own power, within your own scope, and think about what can I do, all you have is yourself. That's all you have to work with. Then you're accountable for everything. There's no room left to blame anybody for anything other than yourself. And now that doesn't mean you should sit and wallow in that blame and say, oh, I suck. This is all my fault. That's not the point. The point is always think about what's within your power. And if something bad happens that you might feel inclined to judge as negative, but it's not within your control, there's nothing you can do about it, no point in judging it. Just think about how you can respond. Think about what you can do that is within your control and judge that. Marcus also writes that we are all cooperating in one great work, some with knowledge and understanding, others ignorantly and without design. So again, we're all connected. The entire universe is connected, and we're all cooperating in this one single thing that we're all doing. That's what Marcus is writing. And he's saying some of us are more conscious of it than others. Some of us are more aware of the things that we're doing, and we are intentional and we design our lives, while others do it without realizing, and they're just going through the motions. And he says that they're doing it ignorantly and without design. And he says, it remains then for you to make sure which is the class in which you rank yourself. The presiding mind will assuredly use you to good purpose one way or another. By the presiding mind, he means I think it's like the universe, like nature or God, the thing that governs the world. And it will enlist you among its laborers and fellow workers. So again, he's saying that you can cooperate. We're all cooperating in the great work, one way or another. You can either cooperate with some sort of knowledge and understanding about what you're doing and be intentional, or you can just move about it ignorantly and without any sort of intent or design. He says, regardless of which one you do, you're still cooperating in the great work and you're still making your contribution. It's just you're choosing or not choosing how to make your contribution. Just a few more passages I want to discuss. This next one is, try to persuade men to agree with you, but whether they agree or not, pursue the course you have marked out when the principles of justice point that way. He's saying, try to persuade people to agree with you. And again, it's important to understand the perspective because the stuff that he talks about is deeply human and you can relate to it on many levels. So to understand his perspective, he's the Roman emperor. He's like probably the most powerful person in the world at that time. And he's surrounded by other powerful people in the world. And he's saying, try to persuade men to agree with you. Whether they agree or not, pursue the course when the principles of justice point that way. So he says, when you are just and when you know you are right, you have to act that way, regardless of whether or not you are able to persuade people to agree with you. But you should try to persuade people to agree with you. You shouldn't just act without the persuasion. And then he says, should one oppose you by force, act with resignation and show not that you are hurt. Use the obstruction for the exercise of some other virtue. And remember that your purpose involved the reservation that you were not to aim at impossibilities. What, after all, was your aim? To make some good effort such as this, well, then you have succeeded, even though your first purpose be not accomplished. So again, try to persuade men to agree with you. Pursue the course when justice points that way, regardless of whether or not they agree with you. And if they oppose you by force, if they obstruct you, use that as a method or an exercise of some other virtue. Perhaps patience or humility or maybe strength, whatever that virtue is. And basically he's saying that try to persuade them, act anyways, and if they stop you or block you because they don't agree with you, and they are able to successfully stop you, then understand that your purpose, your point was to make the good effort and pursue the course in the way that justice pointed, even though you weren't agreed with, and even if they stopped you, your point was to make the good effort, and you have succeeded, even though you did not actually do the thing that you wanted to do. Because again, the way he views the world is you think about things that are within your own control, within your own individual power. And that's a common theme in Stoicism generally. I know I said we weren't going to talk about Stoic philosophy. If you're not aware of it, a big part of that theme is focus and think about you as an individual. Not that you shouldn't think of others, but in terms of when you think about your actions and you think about what you should do, you need to judge what's within your own personal control. What can you actually do? What is within your own influence of power? Another excerpt that I like, that I'm not going to give too much context on it, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but he says, the vainglorious man, or the person who is obsessed with their own vanity or their own glory, places his happiness in the action of others. The sensualist finds it in his own sensations, or maybe their own feelings, their own pleasures. The wise man realizes happiness in his own work. So the vainglorious man places happiness in others. The sensualist places happiness in their own feelings, their pleasures, their own sensations. And the wise man places happiness in his own work. Take that as you will, interpret that as you will, absorb it as you will. Another line, he doesn't actually use the word empathy, but it reminds me of empathy and the importance of empathizing with other people. He says, accustom yourself to attend closely to what is said by others, and as far as possible, to penetrate into the mind of the speaker. So he's saying, listen very, very closely to what is being said by other people. And as much as you can, he's saying, try and read their mind as much as possible. So listen very closely to what they're saying, and then understand that what they're saying, the words coming out of their mouth, is them trying to communicate ideas within their own mind to you. And they may or may not be saying the best possible words for you to realize and understand those ideas. So you have to have that context whenever you're listening to a person. Listen to what they're saying, but try to really interpret and understand where they're coming from. Just understand their perspective. Just like I'm saying in this book when we're talking about meditations. I'm saying, remember the context. Remember, he's a Roman emperor. He's the most powerful person in the world. So it's not just that he's saying these words, it's the person saying the words and the context of who's saying the words. That's why I tell you he dealt with the hardships of losing his children and with famine and plague and war and all of these things. It helps you understand where they're coming from, and it gives the words more meaning and more context. It's important to do this generally in our lives and in the people that we interact with. Empathy is something that can be practiced and something that can be improved and developed over time. But you have to be very conscious of it. And I don't know if I have any specific practical advice right now on how to build or develop empathy, but if you try and think about it And I don't know, I guess that's the best thing that I could probably say off the top of my head is just try and think about it and try and be aware of it, and always trying to think about like where are people coming from, and how words might mean different things coming from them than it might mean coming from you or from another person. All right, last two passages, final two passages that I want to read. The first one is kind of a motivating line to me. It gives me a little bit of a kick in the pants type of feeling when I read it. It says, "No man can prevent you from living according to the plan of your nature, and nothing can befall you which is contrary to the plan of the nature of the universe." I love this sentence. He's basically saying, no man can stop you. No individual can stop you. No one can stop you from living according to your own nature, from being yourself, from getting after your calling, whatever is important to you. No one can stop you from doing that. And then he also says that you will get nothing. You will gain nothing. You will accomplish nothing that is contrary to the universe's plan for you. So no man can stop you, and you cannot stop the universe. You will never gain or get anything that is a contradiction to the universe's plan for you. That's really what he's saying in that sentence. I think it's a very, very simply written, I mean, again, this is a translation, so I assume that the original text was also simply written, but I guess I could be wrong. But at least this English translated version, I'm going to read the sentence again because I like it so much. I think it's very simply written and very profound. It says, no man can prevent you from living according to the plan of your nature, and nothing can befall you which is contrary to the plan of the nature of the universe. Love that. And now for our closer, the last excerpt that I'm going to read that I have marked that I wanted to discuss in today's episode. It says, "Consider what men are, whom they seek to please, what they expect to gain, and how they go about to compass their ends. Think how soon eternity will shroud all things, and how much is already shrouded." He's saying, look around you. Look at other men. Look at humanity. What are we? What do we do? Who are we trying to please? What are we expecting to gain from our lives? I think it's an interesting exercise. Just think about how much you really know about the people in your own family ancestry that came before you, right? It's like you probably, I mean, it's going to be different for everybody's situations, but most people probably have a pretty solid understanding of the generation directly above them, that directly preceded them, their parents' generation. In the sense that they know those people. They know their parents' names. They know a little bit about their story and their lives. They know them personally. And you probably know the generation that preceded them, which would be your grandparents' generation. And you know less about them, and they're a little bit more removed, but you probably know more about their lives and their stories too. And then once you go a generation above that, there's probably a huge gap in what you know. Maybe some people are lucky and they have a pretty developed sense of who those people were, but most people probably not. And then once you get past that one, forget about it. It's like you're lucky if you know their names. Maybe you know, like, oh yeah, maybe you have like one sentence about him. That's my, great uncle that came to this country, and I think his name was this, or like, it's like, so that's like, if you're lucky, you have that type of knowledge. So anyways, my point is that when he says, think about how much is already shrouded by eternity, it's just, We're all insignificant. It's all going to be forgotten. And this is the examples that I was just given. That's our own family. It's like, those are literally like, that's in our genetic line, our ancestors. It's like 2, 3, 4 generations above us. And they never know me. They never knew me. They don't know anything about me. They don't care about me. And I didn't know them. So it's his I think the point is that eternity makes everything insignificant. And while we spend each of our days doing the things that we do, trying to gain things, trying to please people, I'm not saying we shouldn't do all those things, but just to always remember and keep in mind that eternity makes all of these day-to-day activities and everything that we can ever hope to accomplish or think insignificant in the eyes of the universe. So that is the extent of what I wanted to discuss in today's episode of So-Called Discoveries. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about Marcus Aurelius and what he writes about in Meditations. Please let me know what you thought about it. There is so much more that I could potentially talk about from Marcus Aurelius. Everything that I talked about in today's episode came from book 6 of Meditations. And again, it wasn't the entirety of book 6. I just picked out a few things, a few little excerpts here and there that I wanted to talk about. So there's a huge potential pool of wisdom that we could draw from Marcus Aurelius in the future if that's something that resonated with you. So let me know what you thought. You can get in touch through a link in the show notes that will help you connect with the podcast on social media, or you can send an email, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, whatever you want. But yeah, just let me know what you thought. And if you want to learn more about Marcus Aurelius, I will also leave some links in the show notes if you want to learn a little bit more about him or Stoic philosophy, or if you want to purchase a copy of Meditations. I will also leave a link for that. Lastly, please subscribe to the podcast if you have not already done so, and enable notifications so you know when a new episode comes out. And if you're enjoying it, please give us a rating of up to 5 stars. You could also leave a review on Apple Podcasts if you want to write a little something. And with that, we are done. Thank you for your time. Hope you're enjoying these episodes. Hope you enjoyed this one in particular, and I hope you learned something. Goodbye.